Okay, so I see people settling down and getting back and concentrate, so it's a very distinct pleasure for me to announce our second keynote lecture, Maiken Nedergaard. When Stefan and Ryan and I discussed whom to invite for this year's Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Blood-Brain Barrier meeting, it was crystal clear in the very first minute that we do want to have Maiken here spending time with us. And the reason for this is so I actually am personally very interested in spaces, and as a neuroimmunologist, spaces in the central nervous system, and the immunologists have discussed for a long time ways in and out of the CNS. And Maiken's paper, and you see already the title there, has caused something what I think makes this a real seminal paper. It has caused for me personally that colleagues called me again. So it really started discussions. Usually people just write emails these days, right? So if colleagues call you and ask, what do you think about this study? Then you know, this has really stirred us to think and discuss. And this is why we're so happy to have her here today. And we're looking forward that you will talk to us not only about astrocytes, which she called the stars, when most of us blood-brain barrier people didn't even think about astrocytes yet. So we're really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much for coming.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you so much. So I would try to talk about barrier, because this is a meeting mostly about barrier. And thank you so much, Britta, for this wonderful introduction. So if we go straight to it, there's something that's very peculiar about the central nervous system. And that includes both the brain and the spinal cord, and that is it completely lacks lymph vessels. So you all, like Britta, know that the lymph vessels and the lymphatic system play an important role in the immune system. And this is probably how we are mostly taught during our education. But the lymphatic system is a second circulation, and it also plays a critical role in transporting excess fluid and protein that accumulate in between cells back into the general circulation. If the lymph vessels in a leg or an arm fails, you basically get swelling, and that is caused by the accumulation of interstitial proteins in that tissue. So it also has the role that it's transporting proteins that might be difficult to degrade back to the general circulation, from where the liver can be regarded as basically our recycling plane that degraded. So if you are out running tomorrow morning at Cold Spring Harbor, you definitely burst a couple of muscle cells. Those muscle cells do not degrade the interstitial proteins. It just exported. The lymph vessel would pick it up, and they would be transported back to the general circulation. So therefore, really a surprise that the brain that have the highest metabolic rate of any organ, that it doesn't have any lymph vessels. It has been speculated before that the cerebrospinal fluid can act as a sink for basically diffusion of protein that are in between the cell in the interstitial space out to the cerebrospinal fluid, from where it can basically exit brain by the arachnoid villi or from cranial nerves or from diffusion down into the neck lymphatic vessels. However, people who are very smart and know the difference between diffusion and bulk flow have calculated that if you just look at small protein like beta amyloid we just discussed, it would take it many, many hours to diffuse just 1 centimeter within the very complex, tortuous space of the interstitial room in the brain. So therefore it's been deemed that diffusion of interstitial proteins into the cerebrospinal fluid is probably not an effective way of removing proteins. So if you look at diffusion, diffusion is, especially if you look at the very, very tortuous space of the brain, really something that goes very slow, and size matter. If you're small, if you're uncharged, you diffuse faster than if you're large and you're a charged molecule that binds the thing. But then we also have, and I'm sure it's been discussed here, the issue of bulk flow or convective flow. And convective flow is really like a river. If you throw anything in the river, it does not matter on the size. It would basically, big brains would be transported with the same velocity as the small brains, because it's the velocity of the water that drives the fluid flow. So could that exist in brain? Could that maybe promote removal of interstitial waste proteins out of the brain. Maybe, because if you look at a simple brain scan of a patient here, you'd see that the brain is never sitting still. It's never still, because the brain receives tremendous arterial input at the base of the skull. And these big arteries always set up this motion that moves the brain, as you see here. And remember that these pulse waves are not standing still in space, they're actually generated by the heart. So they would flow up along the artery and they would dip down into brain along the penetrating artery. And that could perhaps create convective fluxes that could drive interstitial solutes around. So coming back to that the brain is very unique in that it doesn't have a lymphatic system. The brain is also very unique in another sense, and that is it has a very clearly defined perivascular space. I'm sure you have discussed it before. I just want to repeat it because just a few speakers I saw did not depict the astrocyte end feed correctly. The astrocyte end feed encirculate the entire vasculature in CNS, and EM studies have shown that astrocyte end feed actually cover 99.7% of all the vasculature. So there's no periocyte sitting here facing neurons. You always have an astrocyte membrane that faces the perivascular space, and you can have embedded in the basal lamina a periocyte or another cell type like a perivascular microglia cells, but you'd always have astrocyte end feed completely encirculate the space. So if you look up here at the penetrating artery, you have a very nice defined perivascular space that's called the Virchow-Robin space, and it's directly connected to the cerebrospinal fluid, which means that if you have brain pulsatility here, you might be able to drive cerebrospinal fluid down into the brain. This matrix of proteins you find in the Virchow-Robin space actually directly connect to the basal lamina that's around capillaries and separate basically the vessel wall, that being either endothelial cell or periocyte, from the perivascular end feed. So this creates a very unique space, the perivascular space, that is different from the rest of the brain because it doesn't have a whole lot of tissue of cell processes, which means you can look at it as a low resistance highway for influx of fluid, because what fluid care about is of course resistance. So our idea was that maybe we have cerebrospinal fluid coming in here, pumped basically by the arterial pulsatility. It's driven in here into the perivascular space, and it exits here in the basal lamina and maybe perhaps into the brain parenchyma. In order to study that, we really wanted to do in vivo imaging, because all of these things are really hard to dissect in histological section. And what we did was if we go back to the brain scan, we basically took mice and we injected fluorescence tracer directly into the cerebrospinal fluid in cisterna magna. Why did we choose cisterna magna? Just because it's a nice, there's nice access and it's pretty large space, so we can avoid bleeding when we inject it. But in principle, we can inject the fluorescence tracer anywhere. So this is a setup. We have a mice that is, in most cases, awake. The first movie I would show, it's anesthetized. But we have it trained to sit still on the microscope stage. We would record EEG because the state of brain arousal is important for what I'm discussing. And we would inject a fluorescence tracer into cisterna magna and follow it by 2-photon imaging. So this is one of the first movies, and remember that the penetrating artery played a very key role in our model we were going to test, and that was that the Virchow-Robin space really provide a low resistant input pass for cerebrospinal fluid. So if cerebrospinal fluid enter, we would expect it enter around the penetrating artery. So it would be in a donut-shaped tunnel that surrounds these vessels. So here I've indicated the penetrating arteries, and in order to see them, we just injected IV a red tracer. And we're looking about 180 micrometer below the surface. So when we now inject the tracer into cisterna magna, you see that it first enters parietal cortex, which we're looking at along the pial artery here. And it immediately dips down into this penetrating artery here. Eventually, and this movie is about 15 minutes, eventually you'd see the whole surface of the brain covered in the fluorescence tracer. That's about 50 kilodalton. But the initial stage is a very selective pass in along the PL artery, which we did not expect, because to our concept, the subarachnoid space is basically just one big space. But this suggests that you have some kind of separation here where you have primarily influx along the PL artery, then along the penetrating arteries that's dipping down into cortex, and then eventually it all merges. And you have a complete exchange of the fluorescence tracer within 15 minutes between the cerebrospinal fluid and the interstitial fluid if you look 180 micrometer below the surface. You can do different tricks. So you can inject a small tracer, about 5 kilodalton, and a larger tracer, about 50 kilodalton. In this case here, we didn't do in vivo imaging. We just sacrificed the mice 5 minutes later to see where were the tracers. So we injected them at the same time, and if we do that, we find that the larger tracer are primarily localized perivascular along the penetrating artery, both in cortex, but primarily at the lentostriate branch from the middle cerebral artery coming in here. The smaller tracer, the red tracer, we see exiting from the perivascular space along here, but we also see it in pockets below PIA, and we see it here. And we know now from other studies that this is not just random, this pocket of influx of cerebrospinal fluid. This pocket will indicate that you have a PL artery sitting on top here, and it's pulsing. And just the pulsatility of the PL vessel basically drives the cerebrospinal fluid down into cortex. If you look just 5 minutes again after you inject horsefat peroxidase and you do EM, you would find that horsefat peroxidase is strictly localized in the donut-shaped tunnel that really is the perivascular space. And again, it's separated by the endothelial cells on the inner wall, and the outer wall is the astrocyte infeed. So being a clear biologist, we were really interested in that because one of the big mysteries in the astrocyte research has been why astrocyte express so many water channels. The astrocyte express highly selectively in brain the water channel aquaporin-4. And it was discovered already in the 50s that if you looked at the surface of the vascular infeed of astrocytes, the site that abuts the vessel wall, that 50% of this surface here was basically water channel. They called them square array. They didn't know what that was. Later, John Rash defined using really beautiful EM that these square arrays were water channel. So the mystery has been, why does the brain, and especially astrocyte, in this highly polarized fashion, express aquaporin-4 channels so densely? It's actually higher density than the kidney, and the kidney's function is to transport water. Why would astrocyte do that? Because brain endothelial cells express essentially no water channel. So it's like you have a closed faucet facing an open faucet. It doesn't make any sense. To us, it made all the sense in the world because we postulated that the perivascular space you have here, again, the donut-shaped tunnel, is a highway for fast influx of cerebrospinal fluid. And then if you position water channel right where the brain parenchyma start, right where the resistance start towards driving fluid into the brain, you actually just decrease the resistance towards pressuring fluid into the brain, and you can drive it in. So this was our hypothesis, that aquaporin-4 is expressed in this highly polarized fashion because it supports convective influx of cerebrospinal fluid. This is a immunostaining of two astrocytic-specific protein, GFAP, which you all know. It looks like, I wouldn't say a star-like shaped cell in the brain of a mouse here, but at least it's stellate. And then you have aquaporin-4 that look like it's a vessel stain. It's the same cellate stains, it just really emphasize how polarized astrocyte is and how specialized the infeed are with expression of protein at the surface facing the vessel wall. So in order to test the importance of aquaporin-4 water channel in cerebrospinal fluid influx, we wanted first to do pharmacology, but there's no pharmacology that can inhibit aquaporin-4. So what we did was we worked with the Oslo group and we got aquaporin-4 knockout mice. So we compared its wild-type littermate influx of cerebrospinal fluid tracers to the knockout. and it was very significantly reduced, about 60% reduced. So this suggests that glia water channel play a role in this process. We did a whole lot of more studies using what's called reporter mice, so we could separate arteries from veins. And based on those studies, we came up with a model which we call the glymphatic system, because it's driven by glia cells based on the expression of aquaporin 4 in glia cells, and it has functions similar to the lymphatic system. And in this system, cerebrospinal fluid is driven by pulsatility, at least in part, in along the perivascular spaces. And then it would, supported by aquaporin 4 water channel, basically exit the perivascular space, get into the brain tissue where you have accumulation of protein or peptide or lactate or ammonia, and it would, by convective fluxes, basically drag anything totally unspecific out, and it would accumulate around the veins. I'm not showing the evidence for that, but we have published that. So this was a model, and this was really a collaboration between Jeffrey Lift, that was a postdoc, Rashid Deen, and Steve Goldman. We came up with this model. We certainly realized we were not the first to describe convective fluxes in brain, and in particular, there was a young woman, Patricia Grady, that in her first job as a young faculty member at Maryland University, her name is Patricia Grady, she basically by a mistake, she injected horseradish peroxidase into cisterna magna here in beagle dogs. She would also do it in cats. And she observed that if she looked just 4 minutes later, that the entire vasculature was outlined by horseradish peroxidase. So this was a major discovery, and she published it in 2 papers in the early 80s. Unfortunately, the larger group that existed at that point was not very impressed. They repeated it, but the big groups that repeated Patricia Grady's experiment did one fatal flaw, and that was that they opened a cranial window to look at what was going on. And if you're looking at a pressure system that's driven by low pressure, you're eliminating it. So in the late 80s, several people, including Helen Scher, concluded that if there are cerebrospinal fluid influx along the perivascular spaces, it's inconsistent, it's minor, and there's no polarity. Patricia Grady left science and became an NIH officer, but luckily it's actually a success story, because right now she is the director for Institute of Nursing and is doing really well and has done really amazing work as promoting nurses doing important research. So it's a success story, but I think for young investigator, you should stick to what you observe and don't give up, because we discovered 30 years later what she had described in histology. So if this is important, so of course you can describe this, but we have described a phenomenon. But the key thing is to describe, is this important for brain physiology, or is it just something that happened that really doesn't matter a whole lot for brain health? So our first question was whether this glymphatic system play a role in amyloid clearance. Remember that astrocyte is not supposed to play a major role in either amyloid production or clearance, except the local degradation. So what we did was we basically compared the clearance of A-beta 40 in brains from wild type and aquaporin 4 knockout mice. And what we found, and this is Rashid Deen's work, what he found was that if we injected radiolabeled A-beta 40 into the brain, we had about a 60% reduction in clearance of A-beta in the knockout mice. So this is interesting because it suggests that a protein or peptide that's really involved in neurodegeneration is removed by this, you can call it macroscopic waste removal system. The beauty of this system is it doesn't care what the waste product is. Anything would be transported with it, similar to your garbage removal home, where you basically can dump anything if your town doesn't require that you are separating it out. And I think it's also remarkable, if you look back at it, that the blood-brain barrier have almost no facilitated transport for waste product. beta is probably one of the exceptions, but for most other proteins, they are not transported actively out of the blood-brain barrier, suggesting that probably the brain, similar to what we prefer, we just prefer to dump our waste. We prefer not to sort it and recycle it if we can avoid it. So if this is correct, it could be that this glymphatic system would be important to be able to really test its function in patients, maybe in patients that are at risk for Alzheimer, maybe in patients that arrive at the emergency room with a head trauma. And for that reason, we asked, could we develop a diagnostic test for glymphatic function that is clinically relevant? Because looking at human brain with fluorescence tracers are obviously not a good idea. So in order to do that, we work with Helene Benveniste, that is an imaging MRI emitter. She's really excellent. She's a stony book where she works. And she repeated our experiment. The only difference she did was, first she took rats, because she likes bigger brain. She get better resolution. And she injected contrast agent into cisterna magna instead of fluorescence tracers. And she used an MRI to image what's going on brain-wide. So this movie is, I think, 1 hour long. But I hope you appreciate that glymphatic influx is basically over within 10 to 15 minutes, and you're after that looking at clearance. So looking at movies like this, you start to realize that this must be very metabolic demanding to drive these fluid movement, because it's not the pumping action that where you just set this in motion. You actually have to transport the solute, and this is primarily sodium and chloride, across the plasma membranes in order to drive these fluxes. So we started to ask, can the brain really do this, all this pumping, all this transport of solute and water across the membrane, and at the same time be awake and engage in our surrounding and respond appropriately as we do when we are awake. And for that reason, we start to ask, does this activity of the glymphatic system, does it maybe depend on the state of arousal? So in order to address that, a young couple, Lulu Xi and Hong Niu Kang, addressed that question. And the way we did it was we went back to 2-photon imaging. And we did a couple of changes. First of all, Lulu happened to be amazing with mice, and she could really train them to sit absolutely still at the microscope stage. They actually got so comfortable that they would fall asleep, so she had to wake them up. We also had 2 injection ports, so we could inject 2 tracers as we did before, but at different time points. So this is important because we wanted to study the influx of cerebrospinal fluid in 2 different states of brain activity, so we avoided inter-animal variability, imaging variability, and whatever. And then we also, in all animals, we measured EEG, so we could validate whether the animal was asleep or awake. So we evaluated here, we would start here with an awake mouse, and we would basically, by the EEG recording, we would say, okay, it is awake, it has a low delta power, low slow waves frequency, and then after we gave it, in this case here, ketamine xylazine anesthesia, we could increase the delta power, showing that it was indeed anesthetized. We could also start out with a mouse that was sleeping, and Lulu would basically put her hand in under the curtain and wake the mice up by twisting its tail gently. And we would validate that, okay, it did wake up because the power of the slow waves decreased. And here's just one movie, and it's the same field, and we're again looking 180 micrometer below the surface of parietal cortex. So the only difference here is that it's awake at this state, and it's asleep at this state. In this movie here, and they're played at the same speed. And the whole movie is 15 minutes long in both cases. And there's about an hour in between the 2 movies was captured. So you see there's a remarkable difference in influx in the awake and the sleep state. In the awake state, you see a little bit of the green tracer enter here at the PL surface. Whereas in the sleeping state, in the same field, you see the same primarily along PL artery and then dipping down along the penetrating artery. And within 15 minutes, complete exchange of here a small tracer, it's about 5 kilodalton. So a remarkable difference between awake and sleep and cerebrospinal fluid influx. This is just show another way, just to illustrate it more three-dimensionally, that we have very little influx in the awake state and much more in the sleep state. And opposite is just the data. Actually, I didn't take that, but we can do the reverse. We can reverse the colors. So we inject the green color tracer in the awake state, then we give them ketamine xylazine anesthesia, and we can revert this pattern. But I didn't take this with me. So the obvious question is, why is there such a dramatic difference in influx of cerebrospinal fluid in sleep and awake? The obvious thing is it the pulse pressure that differs? And we thought about that, and we actually didn't even study it because it didn't make sense, because pulse pressure, that being the difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure, is actually bigger. That gap is bigger when we are awake and alert because of more constricted vessels. So that was not the case. So in order to ask another way, how can this difference be? And again, we are looking at fluid movement, so the only thing that really matters is pressure and resistance. It's very simple, it's like plumbing. In order to address that, we contacted the father of the interstitial space volume measurement, Charles Nicholson. Charles Nicholson had basically described all the basic parameters for diffusion and bulk flow within CNS and developed techniques by which you can actually measure the interstitial space volume. So our very simple question to Charles was, could it be that the interstitial space changes in size as a function of arousal? And he could actually address that because he had developed a technique that, to my knowledge, is the only available technique by which you can quantify the size of the interstitial space. So normally, the interstitial space is around 20%, you would say. And our question was, does that shrink during wakefulness and thereby increase resistance toward the movement of fluid into the brain, or does it increase during sleep? So the way you measure with his method, that's called the TMA method, is that you basically have a little cation. It's called TMA. It's not present in brain, it doesn't get into cells, and it's inert. It doesn't initiate any signaling processes. It's pretty much like potassium. So you use electrical current to inject this cation into brain, into the interstitial fluid. And then you would, in a given distance away, you would measure the arrival of this cation with an electrode that can measure this TMA ion. So the idea is that if you have a small interstitial space, the TMA would arrive fast, it would increase fast, the slope would be fast, and the amplitude would be high, because it's basically not diluted. If you have a larger interstitial space, all these parameters is dampened because of dilution. So that's the principle behind the TMA method. And Charles developed this about 30 years ago and have validated in many different models. This is one of the typical currents. So we would inject increasing what's called amplitude of current to get many different slopes and amplitudes. And you can see this is an awake mouse, so we have movement artifact. So when we did this measurement, what we discovered to our big surprise was that in his equation, where you calculate the interstitial space, he calls it alpha, we found that in awake mice, we had an interstitial space that was about 13%, and as soon as the animal went to sleep or we anesthetized it, it increased to about 23%. So this is actually a very, very significant difference in interstitial space volume that would have major impact on fluid movement, because suddenly there's much more space, the resistance decreases, and the pulse pressure can better pressure these convective fluxes into the brain. So this is the basic description of what we have, but you have to ask yourself all the time, why is this important? And in order to again ask, are these convective fluxes important? We always ask ourselves that, is it important enough to really study? Because we are not really fluid mechanics, we are astrocyte biologists, so we have to have a real need to study this. So to study why this was important, we actually worked with Helene Benveniste again. And she did something that was really remarkable, because what she did was she took the imaging, instead of imaging the whole brain, she basically moved the magnet. So she, instead of imaging the front part of the brain, which is not imaged here, she actually imaged most of the back of the brain and the neck. And what happened when she does that? What happens is that you see that you have lymphatic influx to the brain. You cannot see the front of the brain here. But what you note right away when you look at the neck is that you have a tremendous efflux of cerebrospinal fluid contrast agent down right into the neck. And these are actually lymph nodes, if you look at them. So you have a tremendous exchange of cerebrospinal fluid with the cervical lymphatic system here. That has been described before by several very distinguished investigators. But what they did was they injected a radiolabel tracer, and then at a given time point, they took lymph node out and counted how much radioactivity there was in the lymph node. And they actually concluded it was very significant. But when you look at it, you see the dynamic of this process. You must have at least half of cerebrospinal fluid within this movie, which is a couple of hours flowing into the cervical lymphatic. So this is important, again, trying to ask the question, should we study the lymphatic at all? And I just want to show you one example we haven't published of why I really think it's important, and that is a study on traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury is a major health problem, and one of the reasons it's a major health problem is that some fraction of these patients basically develop accelerated dementia. They got into a state where they change personality, they forget, and they become aggressive, sometimes aggressive, and suicidal, and the family don't understand why this person they're married to is so changed, so it has impact on many, many people. So because of the impact on society, it's not surprising that the major healthcare funding agency, NIH, Department of Defense, and medical companies has spent millions, probably billions of dollars on trying to develop tools by which you can basically diagnose how severe are the brain injury. Because the problem with brain injury, again, and especially the mild brain injury, is you can't see it. It's not like you get a wound in your hand. You can't see how it is. If the patient is awake, alert, walking around, you actually often don't know is a significant part of the brain that's damaged, and this patient will be kept away from school, maybe be sedated for a while. So for that reason, there's going a lot of funding into developing biomarkers of tissue injury. And one of the approaches has been the idea that if you have traumatic brain injury, any cell that's injured would leak its cytosolic compound out into the interstitial space. This could be known specific enolase if a nerve cell are injured. It could be GFAP or S100 beta if it's astrocyte. And the idea has simply been that these fairly large proteins would enter the blood by a leaky blood-brain barrier after traumatic brain injury, and that we could just take a blood sample in the emergency room, and you could tell that the kid who got a soccer ball in the head, that they have probably minor traumatic brain injury, they can go home, they can go to school the next day, because we did not detect GFAP or S100 beta in the plasma. So this has been the concept for basically investing in developing the biomarker field. I have a MD PhD student, Ben Plock, and he asked an alternative question. Maybe these markers of cellular injury in brain is not entering blood by a leaky blood-brain barrier, because they would actually have to move against a pressure gradient to do that. Maybe they are rather exiting to the lymphatic system, and thereby the cervical lymph vessels that Helene just had visualized. So this was our question. And remember, this is clinically very important because the lymphatic system, as I just showed you, are completely regulated by the level of arousal. If you sleep deprive a mice, it has no lymphatic fluxes. And if you are a young patient that is admitted because of head trauma, you also are sleep deprived if you are not in coma, because the nurse would come in every 10 minutes to take your vitals, take blood pressure, put light in your eye, so you basically sleep deprive them. So if these biomarkers are leaving the brain by the lymphatic system, we actually can never develop test where we can tell about brain injury, because these markers here would reflect not only the degree of tissue injury, but it would also reflect the degree of the glymphatic system, how effective it removes them from the brain. So in order to approach that, we used a model we are very proud of. We call it the hit-and-run traumatic brain injury model. And the beauty about this model is that, first of all, the mice are not fixed in a stereotaxic frame. They're hanging in the air. So it's similar to a traffic accident that the head is not fixed. They're not anesthetized, and we basically hit them on the side here. We have published it, so not go over it. But it has a number of advantages. Another is that you can actually, because they're not anesthetized, you can perform a complete neurological exam right after the head trauma. So what we did was that we asked whether we can manipulate the lymphatic system and then look at whether that would affect the level of this biomarker of traumatic brain injury or brain injury. So here we just look at blood-brain barrier opening right after traumatic brain injury. I think this is 4 hours. And what Ben did was he used 4 principal, very different way of manipulating the lymphatic system. So for one thing is he used aquaporin-4 knockout mice. They have reduced lymphatic fluxes. He also opens cisterna magna, and remember that if you open this low pressure system, you eliminate it. It doesn't exist. There's no cerebrospinal fluid going into brain if you have an opening. You can also block cerebrospinal fluid production by acetazolamide, or you can simply sleep deprive them. So the first question was, does this manipulation that all are basically taking place after the traumatic brain injury, except for aquaporin-4, because that's a global knockout, would any of these manipulations affect blood-brain barrier permeability? And that did not. So if you look at Evans blue influx in the non-traumatic brain injury control, we have very little. After traumatic brain injury, it increases, and none of these manipulations affected blood-brain barrier leakage. Then you can ask, how good does this manipulation actually affect lymphatic efflux? For that purpose, we injected markers into the brain and looked at efflux. And all of these manipulations very effectively reduced lymphatic efflux to very low value. So then the question is, what would we observe in plasma? And I'm only showing one marker we studied. We studied known-specific enolase, S100 beta and GFAP, but they all behaved similar. And the idea was that after traumatic brain injury, GFAP went up very significantly in plasma. But if we use any of these 4 mechanistic, very different way of inhibiting lymphatic efflux, we completely eliminated the rise in GFAP in plasma. So if this was the boy that has been exposed to sugar injury, and you have taken a blood sample, you would actually conclude you could send him home, despite that he had very severe traumatic brain injury, because the biomarker did not reach plasma. It stayed in brain. And just going out with this pathway here, Helene have described. So I think this little example here, we have many other examples, but I think this probably most clearly demonstrates the power by which cerebrospinal fluid efflux really can regulate what we're studying. So then you can ask, what are the difference? Why is arousal, so the awake state, associated with so little lymphatic fluxes, and the sleep state or the anesthetized state opposite? And for that purpose, we basically copied a paper we read from Columbia University. It's published by a young investigator, Bruno. And what he did was, very neatly, he measured EEG in brains of awake mice. He did nothing to the brain, to the mice, except he added at the surface of the brain a cocktail of norepinephrine receptor antagonists. So receptor antagonists to alpha-1, alpha-2, and beta receptors. Why did he do that? Because norepinephrine is one of the master regulators of arousal. And his question was, if I add antagonist of norepinephrine just to the surface of the brain, without affecting input, without any thalamic lesions, can I change the EEG? And he actually showed he could. He showed he could change the awake EEG with high frequency, low amplitude to typical slow wave, high amplitude waves. So we repeated that, and we found, yes, this paper was right. If you block all norepinephrine receptor and cortex, you can actually revert the EEG, so you get a sleep-like EEG. We also repeated Charles Nicholson's measurement, and we asked, would blocking the norepinephrine receptor change the interstitial space? Because remember, we had a small interstitial space in the wake state and a larger in the sleep state. And in these awake mice, we could actually convert the small interstitial space to a larger space by just locally adding norepinephrine receptor antagonist in awake mice. So then we asked, is glymphatic fluxus affected by these norepinephrine receptor antagonists? And we found that in the wake state, without any antagonist, we have very little influx as before. But as soon as we added this cocktail of norepinephrine receptor antagonists, we could very significantly increase cerebrospinal fluid influx, and again primarily along the penetrating artery, as you see the dip down here. And this is just showing before and after, so it's really a fairly dramatic increase in it. So we believe that norepinephrine is really a master regulator of interstitial space volume and thereby of glymphatic fluxus. Being a glia biologist, we're actually much more interested in what effect does that have on astrocytes themselves. So if you look at this, this is basically our little cartoon trying to explain it. We have in the sleep state a large interstitial space that really support convective fluxus. In the wake state, we have a much smaller space here. One thing that's characteristic about astrocytes is they don't propagate action potential, but they actually propagate calcium signals. So calcium increases is the way astrocytes communicate with each other and communicate with surrounding neurons. So another team in the lab, these are all students, Evan McConnell, Feng-Fei Deng, and John O'Donnell. We asked whether there's a difference in astrocyte calcium signaling in the awake and the sleep state. And we found that if you look here, this is in the sleeping state, we have one astrocyte showing a little bit oscillatory increases. In the awake state, we have these global, widespread, synchronized increases in associated calcium signaling that are completely actually mediated by norepinephrine. We published this a couple of years ago, and it's just been confirmed by Berkel's group that all calcium signaling in cortical astrocyte in awake mice is driven by norepinephrine. And this is just some data here showing that you can have in the sleep state, you have very little calcium activity in astrocyte, cortical astrocyte. In the awake state, you have these synchronized increases that really covers every single astrocyte in the field. And if you add alpha-1 receptor antagonist in particular, so you can add a cocktail, or you can inhibit just with pradosine alpha-1 noradrenergic receptors, you can actually inhibit it. You can also eliminate leukocereus that produce all norepinephrine that's delivered to cortex, and you would get the same pattern. So it's fairly certain that calcium signal in astrocyte is driven by norepinephrine. So this is interesting because it also appears to regulate the cell volume. And you can start to come up with the idea that maybe we have two different functional states of astrocyte. So you have a functional state during sleep where astrocytes have low calcium signaling, they have a low cellular volume, and they're basically working as a kidney, promoting fast convective fluxes to flush the brain free of toxin. Then you have a wake state where astrocytes swell. They're larger, there's less interstitial space. This would, of course, support the precision, both in time of space, of synaptic transmission, because glutamate diffusion would be reduced, and astrocyte would have better access to rapid uptake of glutamate close to the synapse, and you have much less fluid transport in this state. So this is all speculation, but I think in the astrocyte field, this is really the trend we are working at, and working at astrocyte more as a syncytium in different functional stages than looking at the tripartite synapse. That's probably is a developmental phenomenon that disappears as the mice get older. So all of this is speculation, but you can say that one thing it has shown is that you have a state where astrocyte probably is very important for the homeostatic function of brain. Because I think we all forget when we are busy with our own experiment that are very detailed, whether we use molecular technique, imaging technique, or or behavioral assay, we often forget that the brain is an organ that have a tremendous metabolic demand, and therefore it makes just as much waste, and it has to get rid of it. And any organ would just try to get rid of the waste the way that require the least energy. And it is much easier to dump your waste out in cerebrospinal fluid and have it transported out of the brain instead of recycling it by ubiquitination or autophagy, where you basically just actually state that the brain is recycling all its own product. So the concept of the glymphatic system is that we have a macroscopic waste disposal system that's totally unspecific. Any solute present in the interstitial space would be removed. And the fact that this system decreases very significantly, the efficacy of this system decreases very dramatic in aging and after traumatic brain injury, is perhaps one of the reasons that both of these are risk factors for dementia. Because if you look at dementia or any neurodegenerative disease, you can state that they're all basically symptoms of a dirty brain. They all include accumulation of protein aggregation. So it seems to be that the brain have the hardest time getting rid of these proteins that either hyperphosphorylate or misaccumulate around, or they basically misaccumulate as fibrous compound, and then that set up a low-grade inflammation that cause additional damage. So the glymphatic system offers a different perspective to look at it. So since this is a barrier conference, I also wanted to show you a little bit of unpublished data, which we have been working at with different level of barrier. So one idea is that we have this perivascular spaces where I think the importance of glymphatic is really that it gave it a function. Before, the perivascular space was basically just a space, as you said, where you could have inflammation going on and so, but you really didn't have a function in the normal brain state. Now we are saying it is a highway for fast transport of cerebrospinal fluid in. So if you have a perivascular space, you also need to have barrier. We know the blood-brain barrier is very tight, but what about the astrocyte barrier? Is that tight? I don't know whether anybody have studied that before, but that's been one of the things we have been discussing is how tight is this astrocyte barrier? And you can study it at a number of different ways. The first thing we actually did was we asked, is there actually also a space around the pial artery? Is there some kind of filtration occurring before cerebrospinal fluid into the perivascular spaces? Again, I don't know whether that's been approached before, but one thing that's remarkable if you look at cerebrospinal fluid is its low protein content. It's only 1% of plasma. So there must be fairly active mechanism removing protein for cerebrospinal fluid. The first study here is by Jeffrey Leff, and he basically injected microsphere or nanospheres into cisterna magna to see what sizes would be allowed to enter the Virkin-Robin space. So in this case here, he filled the vasculature with red tracer, and he injected 2 micrometer microspheres. And as you can see here, they come rolling in. And again, they don't come in unspecific. They come in along the pial artery, here, pial artery, and they basically never enter brain. So 2 micrometer is way too big. Then you can go down in space, so you can go to 200 nanometer. You can inject that. So all the movement is because these animals are awake. And you can see again, you basically don't have entrance of these microsphere into brain. They accumulate in this probably fairly, it's some kind of, must be some kind of membrane surrounding the pial artery since it primarily enters there. It doesn't just flow in across the surface. And then we can go down to smaller size we could buy, which 20 nanometer. And you would see again they enter along this pial artery here, and again they don't enter the perivascular space. So anything that is 20 nanometer does not enter into the perivascular space here. So then you can ask another way, and this is just to show the final image here. It remains at the surface of the brain. You can also inject different size tracers and ask how much of it actually enter brain. And here we have injected 2 different sizes tracers, about half a kilodalton and 40 kilodalton tracer. and 30 minutes later we have prepared sections, and you can see they actually entered the brain pretty similarly. Probably the smaller tracers in somewhat longer. So for this level, you don't really have a barrier, but the smaller tracer enter better and cover a larger area of the brain than the larger tracer. So then very recently we have started to ask questions about how does the fluxes in the perivascular space, how are they actually occurring? And one of the reasons we have proposed that is because Roy Weller have actually proposed the idea that the reason you have amyloid plaques here in the perivascular space is you have a movement that's different from what we observe. So what he's suggesting is you have amyloid production going on here from neurons, and it would actually diffuse into the para-arterial space and move out along here, and as it's doing that, it starts to aggregate and make amyloid plaque. We have never seen fluxes going this way, going outward. We've only seen fluxes going inward. It's very prominently. But we have asked, can we in some way start to address how are the fluxes in the perivascular spaces? So since we have been doing imaging for many years now, we have some people that's very talented. And what they're doing is they're actually just injecting the tracer directly into the perivascular space. And we're doing it about 100 micrometer below the surface. And our very simplistic question had been, would the tracer move upward or downward? What promotes, in which direction would the tracer move? So in this case here, we have injected a red tracer, and it's actually beta amyloid 40 we have injected, and we have filled the vasculature with green tracer. And this movie is not in time, but it's basically we step down 5 micrometer step, and we start here at the PL surface. And we can't see the injection port because it's 100 micrometer below the surface. But you can see as we're stepping down, we start to see the pipette. And when you get deeper down, you start to see the perivascular outline here of the tracer that's been injected. And in all cases, when we have done that, we see that the tracer by far is transported downward instead of upward. You see a little movement of the tracer upward, probably like 10 micrometer, but basically the rest of the tracer moved downward, suggesting that the pulse pressure, the pulse wave, really pumped the cerebrospinal fluid downward and into the movie. So in this case here, we injected the tracer about 100 micrometer below the surface, and we captured this C-step movie about 10 minutes later. So it looks, when we're doing it this way, like the tracer remain in the perivascular spaces. So that suggests there's a barrier, that the astrocyte make a barrier around it. But maybe that's not the case, so you can ask another way, and this is a time movie. In this case here, we just increase the pressure for the injection to see can we overcome the barrier of the astrocyte and see that the tracer move into the tissue, indicating it's not an absolute barrier. And if you do that, you can see that it actually does diffuse into brain. So astrocyte entry doesn't make a complete barrier because it would enable it if you build up a little pressure that it moves in. And I think there's one other here that's a bigger blow here. You see it really diffuse in. You start to see the black holes that are neuronal cell bodies that exclude the tracer. But studies like this can really start to approach how is the dynamic of movement in the perivascular spaces, how would diseases affect that movement, and how would diseases affect the barrier function? That's probably the semi-barrier function of the astrocyte end feed. That also might play a role in the diseases we're interested in. Then I finally want to thank the people who did the work. So again, this was done by a lot of very talented people in my lab and my extremely talented collaborators in many different labs. Jeff has since left and he's now independent faculty member, but Rashid Dean and me are collaborating daily at the University of Rochester. And thank you for inviting me, and if there's any question.
Thank you very much, Maiken, for this fascinating presentation. And I saw hands already.
Great. It's a fantastic talk, and the model that you presented, where you see changes in the activity of astrocytes, got me thinking, have you ever done experiments where now you manipulate, let's say, the synchronicity of the astrocytes, maybe by knocking out some connexin or something like that, and seeing what happens to this very interesting phenomena?
Yeah, so we have, Charles Nicholson published several years ago, completely independent of us, that the aquaporin-4 knockout mice that affect astrocyte actually have an increased interstitial space. We repeated that in the double connection knockout for astrocytes, so this is connection 43 and connection 30. They actually also have an increased interstitial space. And what we would propose is that this is a developmental adaptation to basically support the fluid movement, to lessen the impact of not having aquaporin or connection supporting these fluxes. No, but it's complex. That's a great question. So one of the ideas is that the calcium signaling is actually suppressing the lymphatic fluxes. It put astrocytes in a different state. They basically focus on the synapse. They're probably metabolic supporting them. They're taking up glutamate, and they're not really engaged in this syncytium activity. It actually fit with the expression of connection 43 that goes up during sleep. And aquaporin-4 goes up during sleep.
A question back here.
Yeah.
So there's a disease, Devick's disease or neuromyelitis optica, characterized by a lab diagnosis with anti-aquaporin-4 antibodies. Did you see any of, it's essentially like multiple sclerosis, did you see any similar phenomenology with the mouse knockout, or how can you reconcile this with the clinical diagnosis with your model?
So unfortunately this disease has not good animal models. So nobody can really study it in animal models. You have to get the complement from the patient and inject LPS and so on. So it's not really great to study. What we do see is, if you look at animal model of MS, is we see very significant decreases in lymphatic fluxes, and particularly in white matter, which is probably not a surprise.
So fascinating talk right here, sorry, in the front. Fascinating talk with, with broad, very broad implications. Obviously you're aware of the connection between sleep and Alzheimer's disease, and also the idea of amyloid or A-beta production as a result of neuronal activity in the default network. So how do you take, you know, maybe let's say Dave Holtzman's model of sleep and neuronal activity, and yours of waste management?
Yes, so actually David Holtzman's work was really one of the inspiration for us when we started. So what Dave Holtzman showed is both in mice models and more important in human patients, that amyloid beta, that the concentration differ in sleep and awake. So it's lower in sleep and higher in wakefulness. And he can increase it further in animal models if he induces seizures. So that is his model for its synaptic activity driving a beta production, basically. Our model is that might be true. No doubt it's true, but it might also be so that clearances increase during sleep, and that can just as well explain the differences.
So do you, I mean, it can explain the differences, but how do you dissect the contribution of each? I'm just curious.
Maybe you don't care. I think the medical company have basically given up on trying to decrease production of beta amyloid. It's not an efficient way of preventing Alzheimer's. So maybe clearance or dumping of A beta would be a more efficient way of going. And remember, the beauty of the system is it's not limited to A beta. It would include synuclein, tau, and other protein implicated in neurodegeneration. But what I know is I actually just visited David Holtzman 2 weeks ago, and our data are completely consistent. And I look at it as a human validation of this to some part.
The relative contribution of each.
Yeah, but maybe it doesn't matter if you just need to get rid of it. You can say that the idea is that people who are active and using their brain and doing all these different brain activity, they should have increased A beta production as they age, and they're actually keeping smarter as they age than people who don't use their brain.
So we have a question here in the back.
Yeah, over here. Very nice talk, many thanks. And I wanted to know if there's anything known about postnatal developmental regulation of the aquaporin-4 polarization. So this is something which is increasing, and how this relates to also vasculature maturation and neural circuitry maturation, which is also postnatal.
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot known. We've done a little bit, so we've seen that aquaporin 4 is expressed very early, like at P1 and probably even embryonic, but it's not polarized. But as soon as you start to, I think at maybe it's already at P1, we actually start to see it's polarized primarily in cortex that have the biggest lymphatic influx during development. So it correlates, the faster aquaporin 4 is polarized, the faster you get lymphatic influx. There's a beautiful old literature on the importance of cerebrospinal fluid for normal brain development. You basically need CSF, and you need fairly high protein content in CSF in order to make a brain. You need it to like a balloon, to have your cortices ballooning out, and then you can build them up going inward. So I don't know what this is not my work, it's work that's been done in developmental biology that's absolutely convincing. So we are trying to link these two together, but it's very clear that lymphatic function, if you look at different region of the brain, correlates to aquaporin 4 polarization. Opposite in pathology, and this is both in aging and traumatic brain injury, you see that aquaporin 4 actually go up in many cases, but it loses the polarization around the vasculature, and it basically spread out and fill out the cell body and the perisynaptic processes. And our idea is that this depolarization of aquaporin 4 expression increases resistance, or it sets up fluxes that's not efficient for removing of waste product, because it's always associated, and you can correlate it in the same mice, and we have done this in several different diseases. You can correlate the depolarization of aquaporin 4 expression to the decrease in influx of tracers. So they go hand in hand.
Three points. First, where does the connection happens? You showed that the lymph or the CSF goes from the limbs into the lymph node in the neck. Did you look for a connection?
Where does it happen?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have mice where the lymph vessels are expressing yellow fluorescence protein, so we can track it. So basically you have that the interstitial fluid starts to accumulate around the deep central vein. So lymphatic influx is all about basically the coming forward and going inward and backward. And then you have this very deep vein where you have a big perivascular space. That's where the interstitial fluid accumulates. And you probably have some kind of transport system in the venous wall itself that transport maybe a bit of amyloid in there. But you also have an efflux going down into the neck. And from there you have, as soon as you get into the neck, you have the lymphatic vessels coming up approaching it. So you probably have a mixture of efflux.
But you don't think it's a linked system? It's probably... So the lymph system is not linked to the interstitial fluid?
Not directly. It has to pass the tissue to get into it.
And then about your comments about concussions or head brain injury, I know the major places when you have deep concussions, the tendency is to sleep, and the actual physician or nurses ask the patient not to get asleep.
Yeah.
Do you think it could be a physiological response?
think that this came out a couple of clinical studies that suggest if the patient are allowed to sleep after the concussion, they actually do better.
Okay.
But my prediction would be it's better to sleep if you don't have a fatal increase in ICP.
And then lastly, a lot of us showed just recently, when you look at extravasation or blood-brain barrier breach, you see those clouds around the vessels. And even if we think about EAE, when you see in the first stage, when you see the lymphocyte sits in that space, could we all be wrong? Could it be coming from the other way around?
Coming from the tissue and in? I'm sure it can. It's biology, but at least when we're doing in vivo imaging, we never see that. So Jeffrey Liv have done a whole set of studies where he's injecting really microscopic volumes of fluid with tracers, and he always finds it goes to the vein. It's only when he increases the pressure, he sees it flowing out along the arteries.
Question here.
Thank you. The data you show implicate that the perivascular astrocytes on arterioles, capillaries, and veins are not made equally. Would you say it's just the polarization of the aquaporin 4, or is it that they are different by some kind of inherent way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually think astrocyte localized around arteries are very different from astrocyte around veins, that you have some kind of zonation of...
what we are seeing is that, for example, PDGF receptor alpha is present mostly around perivascular astrocytes on the arteries. And the second question...
Yes, so aquaporin 4 is expressed 50% higher around vein than arteries.
And the second question, in cases like stroke, when you have stop of the blood flow in the arteries, you see perivascular edema. And most of the people think that the edema forms because of neuronal injury. Would you say that perhaps the edema or the increase in that space forms because we simply have a lack of flow?
Yeah. Also, we just I published with Alexander Trane. We just published basically the speculation that maybe we should revise our concept about edema, being that we haven't really considered these cerebrospinal fluid fluxes in edema formation. And maybe the very initial edema, what's called cytotoxic edema, to some extent reflect that cerebrospinal fluid is kept pumped into the tissue, but the tissue is not capable of getting rid of it. And the implication, of course, is if that's correct, we should all have a cisterna magna puncture when we get a stroke.
Great talk. So I have a question about the cell volume change you mentioned between sleep and non-sleep, because you do have a huge increase in the space.
Huge, yeah.
Right. So did you look at the actual cell size changes?
So we have tried very intensively to really image astrocyte and neurons during sleep and awake, because this has to be done in intact animal. And we just don't have the spatial resolution to see how that changes. We have done it in cultures, and we find that norepinephrine increases, basically get astrocytes as well. So we have a study coming out on that. They actually shrink slightly. But I know that there's a group at the Boston University that have a reporter mice for astrocyte where they actually believe they can see the volume changes and they fit with what we have.
So there are two microphones over there. You fight it out. Who was first?
Thank you. So based on the work that you're showing, we can predict that this glymphatic pathway is also critically important for antigen presentation. So the first question is, can we see a difference in antigen presentation in awake versus anesthetized mice? And the second question is, if we look in animals which are deficient in astrocytes or deficient in astrocyte function, do we see, I know the study from Berkman in the acute EAE model, but in a spontaneous relapsing remitting model, where molecular mimicry is more important in antigen epitope spreading, can we then really tease apart a role for the glymphatic system and antigen presentation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'm by no means an expert. This is not really but Berkman have published 2 studies showing that aquaporin 4 knockout mice have reduced responses to meningitis and EAE, and really didn't speculate on what that was caused by. And it fit with our idea that cerebrospinal fluid is recycled to the choroid plexus, and the choroid plexus might be a place where you have antigen presentation, and you also have efflux to the rest of the body. There's been several studies published that suggest that inflammatory responses are much better during sleep in brain. So I just went to a meeting where I saw like 2 or 3 presentations on that. There's a dramatic difference.
But if I just can comment to that, because I was just thinking of these issues. A number of people looking at, CNS causes of multiple sclerosis in animal models. They have now used the diphtheria toxin receptor system to kill, let's say, oligodendrocytes, and there is no drainage of antigen into the periphery as these people see. And I mean, this is very hard to understand. I mean, you would think, having seen now these videos, you would think if you just kill so many cells with such a genetic system that you should have massive efflux of antigens into the periphery, right? And this is where I'm struggling with.
It might, I don't know how much reach, because again, we are emitting a tracer. We are not emitting those, and you might have parasites that specialize to basically phagocytize thing, so it might not always get out. So if we take any of these mice the day after and look at where are the tracers, it's all in the parasite. All what remains in the brain is in the parasite. So they're probably clean, because you're recycling the CSF, so you always have to remove whatever is in it.
Okay, so there was one more question. Yep.
Hi. I was. This is more than not a question. It's. I want your insight on it. It's going back to astrocytes and the sites where I see. I'm talking about human Alzheimer's and old controlled brains. Whenever I see the site of blood-brain barrier breach, IgG is leaking inside. It feels like the astrocytes are like kind of going and trying to plug it, and then I've seen like it sounds dramatic, but it looks like they are going this way to, feel it. What is your insight on that? What do you think?
Yes, I don't know. I haven't really studied it, but what I do know is that if you have a mislocalization of astrocytic aquaporin 4, they're probably not functioning during sleep as they're supposed to, and you might not have the restoration during sleep. But I don't know about this with extended.
It feels like it's trying to block that thing.
Astrocytes are barrier cells. So if you have traumatic brain injury, you'd see astrocytes make the scar. And Mike Sifoni has shown that if you inhibit reactive gliosis, you do worse. You need these barriers, these semi-barriers to set it up. You can't just have cerebrospinal fluid in direct exchange with the interstitial fluid. It has to go through some filtering probably and some changes in interstitial ions. For example, potassium is different in CSF and interstitial space. It's probably not very good to have too high potassium in your brain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great talk. I had a question about hydrocephalus. I was wondering if your studies can shed new light on the mechanisms of production or resorption, and have you looked at, for example, the subarachnoid granulations?
Yes, so we have a model of hydrocephalus, and we are studying it. Glymphatic fluxes, both efflux and influx, are reduced, for sure. I just went to a conference at NASA where they discussed very intensively cerebrospinal fluid absorptions. And to me, it looked like the arachnoid really is basically dinosaurs. They don't find, people who are doing MRI imaging don't see any fluid going through those. So all the fluid drained out along the cranial nerves and the olfactory bulbs and so on. So NASA is very interested in that because the astronaut basically increases in ICP because of the loss of gravity, and that affects their visions. So this is actually why the next space mission is going to be all women, because they experience less reduced ICP changes, and they don't have the loss in vision when they return from space. So it's very active, but it's not what I'm studying really.
So I think, I'm very sorry, I see still more hands. This is why I would like to stop here, because the cocktails are waiting outside, and Maiken told me she's very happy to discuss over cocktails.